Got it. Right. So, all right. Welcome everyone to the next Water, Wetlands, and Watersheds seminar. It is a great honor today to got it. Okay. Got it. Admit. All right. To introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sadie Hundimer. Sadie is an assistant professor of agricultural and natural resources communication in the Department of Ag Education and Communication at UF here. Dr. Hundimer completed her master's in environmental science from the University of West Florida in 2014. And in 2021, she received her PhD from the School of Forest Resources and Conservation, which now has a new name here at UF, and started just this past year as an assistant professor. Sadie's research draws from the fields of psychology, sociology, behavioral economics, political science, and communication science. So different things than we're used to hearing about in here, not just a hydrologist, not just an ecologist, in fact, neither, right? And her work examines how communication combines with values and worldviews. So you're going to hear about values today that are not dollars, they're not ecosystem service values, they're those things that you hold inside, kind of organize your whole life around, and maybe change the way you respond to science. So Sadie also loves to explore how scientific information is heard and learned and used in a partisan environment, which you might know we are living in. So I'll leave it there. And Sadie, please help me welcome Sadie to our seminar.
Thank you.
Share this. Hide this. And I will spotlight you in a second. Okay. All right. It's all yours.
All right. I can always
Grab that mic.
count on David for a good introduction. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to come present here. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is bringing communication science together with the natural science, because we are really in a position where we can help you maximize the benefit of all of the work that you're doing. And too often is the case that communication kind of comes in at the end of a project to disseminate results. And I hope that what you see here is the value that integrating communication science early on can bring. So I got on this path. Okay, so I started down this research path when I was a grad student, and I was brought on to be on this project called Facets, the Floridan Aquifer Collaborative Engagement for Sustainability. And the people that you see here represent a lot of people. We have researchers in water, land use, economics, and social science from Florida and Georgia on this project. But just as important, we have representatives from agriculture and forestry and environmental interests and community government. All of us are working together on what's now a 5-year project to look at what water futures would look like in the Floridan Aquifer region based on different water management, land management scenarios that we could start at any point now and then look into the future to see what that would mean for water and for the economy for different groups of people. And so what ultimately comes out of a project like this is we're going to find trade-offs, that there's going to be different benefits for different groups of people depending on the choices that we make. And so what we ultimately want from this data is that we're generating all this trade-off information that can go to the public sector and to government officials who can then make good decisions that are in the public interest, whatever the public interest is decided to be at that point in time. So I'm coming in this and I'm on the communication research team, and maybe this is a reflection of my personality, but I'm thinking, what could go wrong? And to me, it's like, it was pretty clear what could go wrong is that this is potentially a partisan topic. We all know that water is a partisan topic in Florida. You can open up pretty much any week of Gainesville newspaper and find some article to that topic. And mostly where we're seeing this, though, or at least where we feel it in the news, is between specific stakeholder groups that have different water perspectives. So we have to deal with that. But then we also have to think, well, right now, the general public isn't too invested in water topics. It's not like neighbors are fighting over the way we're managing water. But we're getting to a place where water is going to be a bigger issue. Or if there was a policy that came out of the trade-offs that come from facets, that could be a bigger issue. And maybe it does become more of a political issue in the general public, where it could be Republicans and Democrats, conservatives, liberals, looking at water from different perspectives, because we all know that if we're going to divide as a society, that's how we tend to do it. So again, what we want out of Facets is we have this great research being done by all of these people who are very invested in this project. And what we hope is comes out of that is information that can be objectively used for decision making. But for that to happen, people have to believe the information that comes out of this group and from scientists like yourselves. And you might be thinking, well, I work on water models and I'm looking at how particles move through watersheds, and this isn't something that's going to be particularly partisan. Why would somebody not believe me? So let's play that out. And what we're going to do is look at some charts. But before I give you the real data, I just want you to understand how to read the graph and interpret this chart. So here we have what kind of a question to people: is fertilizer a source of water pollution in my state, or is it not? And we ask people, what do you think that water scientists believe to be the case? And again, this is just sample data, not the real thing yet. And maybe we get a graph that looks like this, where we have maybe 55% of people saying that they think scientists believe fertilizer is a source of water pollution, and maybe 10% think that it's not. And we don't have a whole 100% there, because some people are selecting, I don't know, because they just aren't confident enough to even venture a guess. So we ask that question, but then we also ask, what do you personally believe? And maybe that looks like this, that hopefully they're personally believing pretty close to what they think scientists believe. And we see these lines are roughly parallel, meaning that people are adopting beliefs that are in line with what they think scientists are saying. That's what we want to see. In fact, we might see this line be a little higher than the scientists' beliefs, because they're selecting I don't know less frequently, because they're more confident about what they believe than what scientists believe. What we don't want to see is this, where people think scientists believe one thing and they are then actually believing the opposite. That's what we are calling the water science communication problem. So let's now look at this with the real data. We're going to look at it with the political left and the political right broken out, because again, we're going to see that divide. That's probably where it's going to be based on what we see with other scientific issues. And what we see is exactly what we want to see, that those lines are roughly parallel for both the political left and the political right. They are personally believing what they think scientists believe, and we love that. Here's another one. Septic systems are or are not a source of water pollution in my state. We again see roughly parallel lines, and you're going to see the slope of those lines change because people are less confident in their knowledge and their perception of scientists' beliefs here. But still, we're seeing that they're roughly the same pattern, roughly parallel. That's what we want. But we have other questions that don't show this pattern. And here's one of them. Climate change will or will not impact the availability of water in my state. Seeing those roughly parallel lines on the political left, we don't see it on the political right. So we at least have some people on the political right, not the majority, but some group of this segment that is adopting personal beliefs that's different than what they think scientists believe. Here's another one. In 20 years, there will or will not be enough surface and groundwater to meet demand throughout the state. We're seeing the same pattern. Now, before you jump to a conclusion that I don't want you to jump to, this is not a problem of conservatives. There's a reason that we're seeing this happen on this side of the chart with this topic. And if we ask the different question in a different way, we'd see the same thing happen on the political left. So this is just a human behavior problem, not a one-sided political issue. And let's explore why that might be. Why would we see this happen on the political right? Well, it's what we call solution aversion. The science gets rejected out of an aversion to the implied interventions. And you can imagine that if it is fact that, if we go back here, if it's fact that climate change is going to affect availability of water, or in 20 years, there's not going to be enough water to meet the demand throughout the state, what that might mean from a intervention perspective, that potentially there's going to be more regulation. And what we know from the values of the left and the right is more adverse to more regulation. They want more freedom of land use relative to the left. Now, if we had a question that was, I bet you do agree that the springs are getting better and therefore would require less regulation, then we could potentially see the same thing happen on the political left. Or if it's a topic of GMOs, where the left would like to see more regulation and less freedom of GMOs to increase, GMO use to increase, then we might see the same thing happen on the left. We're seeing it happen on the right here because of solution aversion. So what this tells us is, first of all, we can't just talk about the facts. When we come out of this Facets project with these trade-offs, we have to be aware that people might be adverse to even hearing those facts and accepting them as true because of solution aversion. Now, the charts are great, but I'm with a group of scientists, so let's make sure that we have enough support here. So in addition to those charts that you just saw, what else we did is we have the belief assessment is what you just saw. We also conducted a knowledge assessment. This is what I call the OWSK, or Ordinary Water Science Knowledge Assessment. And this is essentially a test that we give to people. It is a test of the knowledge needed for an ordinary person to competently participate in water discussion and make citizen-level voting decisions on water topics. So it's pretty basic questions like this. What is the primary source of drinking water in North Central Florida? We're looking for underground water. That's the kind of questions that are on this. So when we combine these two things, beliefs and knowledge, we regress those two things together. What we find is that on topics that suggest politically undesirable policy, there is no significant relationship between scientific knowledge and water belief. People are basing their beliefs on something other than their knowledge. So, talking about facets. Scientific information alone is not enough to make people hear those facts as true. Water decisions are ultimately value decisions, and people are coming to what they believe, not just on the scientific information, but on what that information means to their values. So what we have to do is think about how can we reduce the sense that water science is inevitably going to lead to politically undesirable policy for half of the population. There's two ways we can do that. We can look at what is the message and who is the messenger. See how that might play out. We can think about a hypothetical sample ballot item that could be on the Florida voting ballot this year. Okay, so you might say that tax-funded incentives will be given to farmers who adopt water protective best management practices, new and improved best management practices. People could vote yes or no on this. But we know that people don't just read that policy text and base their decision on that. They're hearing a lot of different things that's helping them decide, should I vote yes or should I vote no? And one of those might be that they read a local newspaper and it's an opinion piece, and it's saying that proposal 1 fairly compensates farmers, and this just happens to be written by a Republican. So that's going to affect their thoughts, both because of the message and who the messenger is. But that's not all they read. They're hearing both sides. Before we go there, what does this message look like from Republicans? It might be something like this. Proposal 1 fairly compensates farmers for protecting natural resources. Proposal 1 would equitably compensate farmers for investing their considerable time and money in practices that would protect our state's water supply. Florida waters are overused and polluted due to the behaviors of every person in the state. Fortunately, farmers' willingness to bear the burden of adopting new practices can partially make up for our collective impact, and it goes on. That's what that argument might look like from this person. But like I said, they're not just hearing this one opinion piece, they're hearing other messages as well. So they might read another opinion article that says, proposal 1 unfairly pays farmers. And this one's coming from a Democrat. Might look like this. Proposal 1 unfairly pays farmers to stop damaging natural resources. Proposal 1 shows favoritism to farmers, inappropriately paying them to stop degrading water that all Floridians depend upon. Current farming practices use unnecessarily large amounts of water and pollute that water with excess fertilizer. This biased proposal uses public money to unjustly reward farmers for the damage they have caused. So now they have a lot of stuff to weigh here. They have two messengers, plus they have the text of that policy to begin with. And so this is actually a research study that we conducted, and we played out this scenario, and we had people exposed to each of these pieces, and at each stage we're asking how likely it is that you would vote yes on this proposal. But we also know things can go in a lot of different ways. So we also switch the order in which they get these opinion pieces, and we also switch who is saying what. And now we can do is break apart all the pieces and understand what those pieces impact is. You can also change up that whole message. Instead of talking about whether it's fair or not, we can say it's loyal to farmers or loyal to the community or disloyal. We can do all kinds of different things here. And here's the results. So this is where we start. And this is just reading the policy text without any opinion pieces, without any messengers. This is where policy support is from the political left to the political right. And you're going to see more support for that policy on the political left, and that's what we expect to see. Again, we are groups with different values, and the political left puts a higher value on environmental protection because we have limited amount of resources as a government, as a society, and what we focus on in one way, we can't focus on another, and political right has different priorities, okay? So we're expecting to see this, and this is what we see, higher support on the political left. Now, probably someone who's promoting this policy, what they want to achieve is not only to increase that line overall, but we want some more balance there. We don't want this divide between the left and the right, because that is partisanship. That is what breaks down those negotiations and talks and gets us to a place where we can actually implement water science. So when we add that message, now we're not talking about messengers, not who is doing the communicating, but just the subject. Is that a fair or unfair policy? Is it loyal or disloyal? What that message does is move that line up and down. And it does it the same for both the political left and the political right. That line is going up the same amount or down the same amount, depending on whether they heard it's fair or it's unfair, or whether it's loyal or disloyal. And it's important that maybe this seems obvious that the line's going to go up and down, but the way it goes up and down wasn't obvious, because what we didn't see is the slope of that line tilt at all. We're not achieving any more balance there. What also wasn't necessarily obvious is that when they again get the second message, now they're hearing both sides, it's fair and it's unfair. What happens is there's no effect of those messages. So if you have someone out advocating for one way or the other, if they're hearing the other side, it might just be completely taking them back down to that baseline. But we have another factor here, and that is the messenger. So what the messenger we found is doing is rotating that line. It's either making it more polarized, increasing the slope of that line, or less polarized, depending on who's speaking and what message they're giving, that combination. So, well, as we said with the message, when we heard two messages, it just knocked each other out. They had no effect. The same does not hold true for the slope of that line changing from the messenger. That effect stays. So it either got more polarized and it stayed more polarized when they heard from the other party, or it got less polarized and that stuck. So ideally, what someone who is communicating a policy would want to see is we want to see that line go up and it be more bipartisan. So how do you achieve that? Well, first of all, as I just said, you need the right message and the right messenger, but you also need more stakeholder support so you have less competition. The only way that we don't have this loss with this competition effect when we get the other one is if there's less people giving that anti-message. So we need to achieve both. And so what this all is coming back to is what we've all heard a million times is you have to have stakeholders involved and engaged and therefore can be on board, because if we're looking at the left and the right, what we know from other research is that the left tends to identify more with like an agricultural viewpoint, the right with a more of an agricultural viewpoint, the left with more of an environmental viewpoint. And so they are likely to adopt the views of their stakeholders. So if we can have stakeholders involved and engaged, that's what ultimately is going to have all of these trickling effects. And we're not necessarily on the facets team interested in any specific policy outcome, but looking at the policy is a way to think about how we talk about the trade-offs themselves and who should be communicating about those trade-offs and the way they should be talking about them, not just the facts, but also the values. Because we're not advocating for any certain outcome. We're just saying, here's the trade-offs. We want you to be able to hear them, and we can test that through policy. So this brings us to the next difficult question. which is how do we reduce the stakeholder conflict that we already have? Well, on this Facets project, as I said, we have a lot of different stakeholders represented. And specifically, we had these groups, although there are more water stakeholders that we could have. And it's important to say here that people aren't just in one group or another. Everybody's kind of a blend of different pieces here. In particular, if we look at producers and environmentalists, there's a ton of crossover there. A lot of producers consider themselves environmentalists, and a lot of environmentalists have some foot into agriculture. But when we ask these people, who are those that share your water values or have different water values than you have, the greatest perceived difference is between those two groups. And that's what we see represented in a lot of the news articles, right? And so from a communication perspective, I'm like, well, what is it that they're actually have different views on? What are they disagreeing about? And when you look at the results, it's hard to tell at first because their interests are very common. When they respond to our questions, they're saying both of these groups have a perception that there is a very high risk to surface and groundwater. And both of these groups, when asked where should a limited water supply go, they're both saying that it should go to crops and ecosystems. Producers are saying that and environmentalists are saying that. So you would think these are the groups that should be most in alignment about what our water future should look like and finding solutions that serve their collective interests. So the place where they disagree is one really clear place that came out, and that is their perception of producers' contributions to water issues. So environmentalists see producers as having a more negative impact than they see, and producers are therefore feeling unfairly blamed for that. Well, next question is why, and what can we do about this? And the way that we have researched this and engaged it is through mental modeling. So I'm going to walk you through the procedure that we use to examine this. And it starts off, I'm going to take you through each of these pieces, but we start off with a prompt. And what we do is we have all of these stakeholders that are on the project and also others outside of the project sit down with us, and they're one-on-one going through this activity, or is individually going through this activity. It starts off with this prompt, and we ask them to think about this. Imagine someone you know recognizes your knowledge of local water issues of water quality and quantity, and asks for your honest perspective on the relationships between water and the regional economy. We just have them sit and think on that for a minute. What would that conversation look like? And then we give them a stack of cards, and there were actually 57 cards in this deck. This is a sample of them. You see it ranges from ag to environment, economic terms, a whole range of things that could be in that conversation. And what we say is go through this stack of cards and set those cards into two piles. Those things that you would include in the conversation and those that you wouldn't. And then we're going to take that wouldn't pile and set it aside as the discards. And now you have your set of terms that you would include in that conversation. Now we give them some blank cards. We say, okay, add additional terms, things that you would include in that conversation. Now take this whole set of keep cards plus the ones you added and divide them into groups of things that logically go together in your mind. Those are our categories, and then give it a category name. And what we have at the end of that is for each person, we have this visual representation, physical representation of the way they think about this relationship between water and the regional economy. So this is just for one person, though, mind you. What I want to know ultimately is how producers as a whole conceptualize this relationship and how environmentalists as a whole conceptualize this relationship between water and the regional economy, because then I can understand the different ways they're thinking and why we're having trouble getting that connection across those stakeholder groups. So to do that, we use a software that's called Anthropac, and what it creates is maps like this. So here's the producers, and each of these dots is one of those cards that had a term on it. And roughly speaking, the distance between any of those points tells us how frequently that group put those two terms together in a pile. And so when you look over here at these purple ones, there's, you can see like really tight cluster there. So that tells us that irrigated row crops and precision agriculture and agricultural water use permits were all put together pretty commonly in the same pile by people who identify as producers. But they didn't usually put those terms in a pile with septic tanks or municipal stormwater runoff. That's why they're far apart. The other thing that the software does is it's creating these circles around terms that were most commonly grouped together by producers in this case. And so we kind of get that conceptualization of if as a group they did that card sort, what that would look like. And when we look at the producer one, what we kind of see is, well, we have this big agriculture group, and it's pretty distinct from the other groups here. We have environment, municipal, and in the middle, kind of tying everything together is socioeconomic. Obviously, there's a big emphasis on agriculture, and we can kind of look at this as maybe an operational view of this system, which doesn't maybe become apparent until you look at the environmentalist. And it's quite different. We see just very different clusters to start off with. We see this big water impacts one that kind of takes over the middle. And it's not just agriculture things mixed in there. We have industry and municipal water use all mixed into this idea of water impacts. And we have water management as another big circle. We didn't see that with producers. Tied in the middle is decision making. It's just a different way of thinking about this relationship between water and the regional economy. And a lot of analysis goes into this, much more than I could talk about today, but what we ultimately take away from this is that that producer mental model is very operational to that farm scale view of water. They understand the things that they are doing on the farm to protect water, all of those steps and BMPs that they're putting in place and how it interrelates with their economic situation and the economic situation of the community. Environmentalists don't have that view of the system. What they have is this watershed scale view where they're seeing all of these impacts combined and they're looking at them as impacts and thinking about how can we address them. So when we get to this place where producers feel more blamed than they feel they should be, it makes a lot of sense because environmentalists, they're focused on what are the issues. Producers are seeing what's going on their farm and the measures that they're taking. Environmentalists are seeing problems of scale. Producers are seeing what they are individually doing. And so we need to figure out how do we bridge that divide and help them see each other's point of view. And these kind of maps are one way that can do that. This gets that conversation going in a less personal way. But from a communicator's perspective, it also gives us some tools to do this as well. And one is we can look at where any of those terms fell in those maps. So one of those terms, for example, nutrients. Nutrients was in that cluster of agriculture for producers. When they hear the word nutrients, they're thinking this is an input to my economic well-being, to making my crop work. But when environmentalists hear nutrients, the first thing they're thinking is water impacts. And so I need to be aware of that when I say nutrients, they're going to two very different places. And environmentalists are thinking of problems at the same time that producers are thinking about their job. There's another way we can use this, is we can look at, if you remember this card sorting activity, the first thing we had them do, or well, maybe it's the second or third, is sort those cards into two piles, the ones they were going to keep and the ones they were going to discard. So 71% of producers kept risk management. They think that's an important part of the process. 37% of environmentalists kept it. So that tells us that maybe we can help create this parity of views by helping environmentalists see the importance of risk management to this system of water and economics. Same thing with anything else on this list. We can also do the same thing in reverse. What did environmentalists select more frequently? They selected climate change more frequently. And that doesn't mean that producers don't believe climate change is happening. It's that they don't see it as critical to that relationship between water and the regional economy as environmentalists do. And so that's a place where producers could be brought to see things more from the perspectives that environmentalists have. And so what I take away from all of this is, first of all, much stakeholder conflict really, in some ways, is a false conflict because they actually have so much in common. Their interests are really parallel, but there's this tension that holds them back, and that's that perception of each other and each other's views. And really the perceptions of farmer impact relate to these experience-based mental models. It's the mental model that we should expect them to have, but we haven't known how to deal with it. And this gives us those tools. We can work with this. So what I hope you take away from this is not only the value of including this type of results into your work, but bringing communication in early so that we have the opportunity to find these problems before just disseminating the information when it's just a matter of disseminating facts. There's not a lot that we have to grasp onto. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, we'll open it up to questions. We'll start in the room, and then I'll see if we get anything from YouTube. So Andrew, lead us off, please.
Yeah, thank you, Sadie. It was really interesting talk. It's very different from the way I kind of think about research and science in a lot of ways. I'm just kind of curious, kind of a technical question. So for both right and left political leaning folks and also producers and environmentalists, were they self-identified as such, or did you identify them based on?
They were
some preliminary
self-identified,
questions?
yes. So when we're looking at the producer environmentalists, what we did is we're like, okay, on a scale, how much do you identify as all of these different roles?
Okay.
And then if there was a big enough difference between one or the other, that's when we would put them in a group for comparison. But yeah, most people were both. Same thing with conservative, liberal, left, right. We had them identify on a scale for how you personally identify and to what extent your views align with those groups. So those I was thinking, yes.
What was your end? How many people?
On which item?
How about the like the ordinary water science knowledge and the
Okay,
the
yeah, I think we were around 1,600.
1,600.
Yes.
So generally, that was the case for most of the questions.
No, so we had I think like 3,600 on the policy study, and then the mental model study. Those you can actually do with as small as 3 people. We had about 40 something, but it's the richness of that data means you need a much smaller N. But there's in each of those cases, well, the first 2, yeah, I guess all of them. We're looking at Florida and Georgia across the entire population of those states.
Mailed to them, or?
No, we did it with Qualtrics. They actually recruited the sample.
We have a question from the Zoom, which is, when did the study occur and how did you get all these stakeholders to participate?
Well, so this has been over, I guess, the past 4 years. Each of these studies has taken place. And as far as public stakeholders, well, you pay them and then they participate, and that's through Qualtrics has recruited that sample. As far as actually the producers and environmentalists that we spoke with, these are a lot of people that are on the team, but also half of that sample is from other stakeholders, which we're kind of doing a slow ball sample of where people have contacts and have people who are willing to participate. And so that does kind of bias the sample a little bit because we have those people who are more invested in getting involved in that way. So we are always aware of that. But when we see those differences between the groups, we actually think those differences are probably very conservative because we're bringing people who want to participate in that process together.
We're
We'll probably see,
selecting.
yes, we'll probably see more difference if we were able to get a true diverse population sample.
Yeah.
How was the information presented to them? Was something that they read, or was there video? And did that make a difference?
Yeah, so for the policy, it was definitely just reading it. And part of the reason for that is that every variable you introduce is just another factor to consider. But yeah, we're going to do some new studies coming up that are going to be video for that reason, and we'll see how that changes things. What we'll actually be doing is presenting some of the trade-off data that comes out of facets, although it's more generalized than facets, and presenting that trade-off and see how they understand the trade-offs and actually if they can comprehend what those mean and how it would affect their policy support as a result.
So I'm going to make a plug out here to the YouTube crowd. There is a chat in YouTube, which you can add questions to. I'm pretty shy on YouTube, so let's see if we can get a question from YouTube, and we'll go back to the room. Any other questions? Because I have one about the mental models. I did the mental modeling exercise. It was a very long time ago now, but thinking about both the producers and the environmentalists had the environment kind of off to the side, which I mean, again, I don't know how much to interpret about the relative location, but or if there's some subjectivity in the grouping. I know that there's software and it maps it, but I would have imagined it maybe for both that there was a more of a Venn diagram between the environment, especially for the environmentalists and the other things.
Right. I agree. I think that's interesting as to why it is set off as much as it is. And I guess it's more just that it's not as integrating with all of those other more complex aspects of water management. But yeah, I would have expected to see the same thing. And I'm not sure what that is. If it's that it is seen as a little disconnected from like the social reality, but that's an interesting thing to explore in itself.
Maybe for the environmentalists, there's these impacts, and then maybe like the environment as the receiver or something like that. And then I mean, but the like the grouping, the color coding is from the card stat, like the categorization that the users did, right?
Right.
So
yes, it's the distances are roughly speaking, but still we have this situation where environment is off on its own. And I think that that's just a really interesting thing to explore is why that is the case. Why is environment seen as somewhat disconnected? And that's probably a communication problem that we also have to address.
So what is the basis for the distance? How is it calculated?
Okay, so you're asking a really tough question now. So it's a multi-dimensional analysis. And so it's trying to accurately represent the distance between all of those points. But of course, in 2 dimensions,
What's the distance? I mean,
the dimension, how frequently they were grouped together by those participants. So then it's trying to do this in all its dimensions, which is, in this case, since there are 57 cards, it's actually 56 dimensions that it's trying to collapse. And that's why you get these imperfect representations. But yes, it's based on how often they're grouping those terms.
So sort of like a piece, like a principal components analysis or some other ordination,
Right.
Something like
Yes.
that. Yeah, go ahead.
So you did this study with a Democrat source and a Republican source. Was there any interest in doing with a centrist viewpoint? Thinking how that affects the.
I'm going to repeat the question. Yeah. So the thinking about framing Democrat versus Republican, not versus, but compared
Sure.
with Republican. What about a centrist or an independent or some other political stripe?
Yes, and so I've been talking about this as these poles, but it's really the spectrum, and the spectrum is represented in all of those graphs that you were looking at. It actually is showing us at each point along that spectrum where people are falling. So they really were pretty much falling in the middle.
Well, can you share with us, so you've been this 5-year Facets project, and we've started, with people that didn't know each other, both from environmentalist agencies, academics, and producers, and we've like grown a lot together. And so do you have any like particularly either heartwarming or blood curdling examples of where this sort of stakeholder, like the process of communicating with each other, like it's changed someone's mind?
Well,
If you feel comfortable to share that.
yeah, I don't know if I have a specific example, but we meet with this group, I don't know, maybe every 6 months or so, like actually in person prior to COVID, and after COVID, maybe we'll be able to do this again, but it's not that frequently that we're getting together, but we are communicating in webinars and things like that. And so because there's this space between these meetings, you can definitely see a change in people as we go from one to the next. And at the beginning ones, you could definitely feel more tension between the groups, and it was more discussion of us versus them. They think this way, they're wrong, we're right. This is the logical way to see it. And now it's totally different. All those conversations are about how can we do this in a way that helps everyone. And that's the challenge that I feel like communication has, is how do you get to that place without 5 years?
Yeah.
And so that's why we get to these places where we have to have these shortcuts of what's the message and what's the messenger, because we can't do it.
I mean, what do you sense like over that process, and then like you're kind of achieving what I guess the goal is to like bring people together towards common viewpoints and or a common perspective and solutions, but how much of that is like the kind of education and the facts, like we kind of started this talk with, and how much of it is just people getting to know each other on a personal level and seeing that okay, like people are complicated, there's a lot that goes into viewpoints.
Yes.
In some ways.
It's
I mean, do you have a sense for that kind of?
It's all of those things, and I don't think I could ever, attempt to break them apart. But it's one of the, like, I think that really comes down to why the messenger matters so much, is because if people don't have the opportunity to build those relationships, I can see somebody's Republican or Democrat or producer environmentalist, like, oh, they're on my team. If they know what I should be thinking, then I can just follow them. And so what we built as a result of facets is more of those messengers that actually do have that perspective. So hopefully it moves us in that direction that way.
So I got a text question. This is probably the first time. This is from Christine Angelini. Great talk. How are you thinking about translating these findings into a communication strategy of the project findings?
Great question. So we have I would say that our strategy at this point is inadequate because it always is going to be inadequate at this scale. But what we're doing is we are developing a guide that is going to go out to all of the people who engage these topics in extension, government leaders, people who are involved in this project. This project also has a project advisory council, and they're going to do a lot of the legwork to help move this project and this material forward. These are people who are at higher positions in different organizations that can help get that word out. And every time we have the opportunity, we're talking to them about these pieces. And we're hoping that there's a next phase and the next phase of this project that gives us more of the opportunity to build in those communication outreach pieces.
I mean, one thing that this project did, which I don't know how much you were involved, we held water schools. So they were specific, you know, these are more informational because they were like agents of needs and things like that to try to take this scientific information and get it to, you know, in an objective way towards decision makers. I think some of the more like the broader communication strategy about message and messenger is a little more fuzzy, right? About like how do you take these more value-based communications out to the world. And so one thing we're trying to do is like developing key findings and key messages. And it's like a pain, it's total pain. But it's like you wrote the paper, right? The key finding is graph 3, right? But then being asked by folks on the communication, so like, what does that mean? Like, how do you convey that? And then they putting it through this mill for like months and months, like, what is the key message? And that's been, I mean, we're in year 6 of the year 5 project, by the way. I don't think we're there yet. So
yeah, and every opportunity I have, I'm having these conversations, as are so many other people on the project, to try to disseminate that information. And you know, when you see opportunities, please let me know.
all right, well, let's do another round of applause. Dr. Hundimer, thank you so much. All right, everyone online, good to see you next week. Thanks for tuning in. Well.